My name is Matthias Austin, and on this podcast, I invite you to ask me anything about Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, or anything related to the greater legendarium of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I will do my best to give you as in-depth an answer as I can. And I hope you were able to check out the first part of the Patreon bonus episode I put out last week, which was my conversation with friend and philosopher of the show Peter from Things You Can Do about the first chapter of The Hobbit. He has graciously agreed to do all of the Wizard's Pupils episodes with me, schedule pending, and as a result, those bonus episodes are easily twice as long as the regular podcast episodes. So if you want to hear way more of me, check it out. Patreon.com/LOTRAMApod. And if you sign up at any level, you are able to vote on episode topics, which, by the way, anyone can submit at LOTRAMApod.com. And the Lotrama Pals, that's what we're calling supporters of the show, selected this week's topic, which comes from a couple of different question askers. The first being from regular contributor Noah in California, who asks, I've been trying to find out more about Faramir's backstory/history. Could you please go into more detail about his life? And the second, related question, comes from my real-life sister, Abby, in Washington State, who asks, is there much known about Faramir and Eowyn's story? They fall for each other in the House of Healing, but do we know anything else? Do they end up as king and queen of Rohan, or does Éomer become king? What happens to all three of them? Well, thank you, Noah and Abby, for those questions. And by the way, my voice will get weaker and weaker as we do this. I'm battling a little bit of a cold, but hopefully it doesn't sound too weird. Now, the Lotrama Pals have decided we'll be talking today about Faramir's past and future, so let's just dive in. Before we get to his fictional history, let's start with the history of the character, because he is an example of one of those instances where things just happened as Tolkien wrote. He was constantly surprised as he wrote when things would just appear on the page that he hadn't planned, almost as though he was uncovering the world rather than making the decisions. And in a 1944 letter to Christopher Tolkien, then serving in World War II, Tolkien wrote, a new character has come on the scene. I am sure I did not invent him. I did not even want him, though I like him. But there he came walking into the woods of Ithilien. Faramir, the brother of Boromir. And he is holding up the catastrophe by a lot of stuff about the history of Gondor and Rohan, with some very sound reflections, no doubt, on martial glory and true glory. But if he goes on much more, a lot of him will have to be removed to the appendices, where already some fascinating material on the Hobbit tobacco industry and the languages of the West have gone. Now, a few things to note here, the first being that this letter was written a decade before the Fellowship was released, so it speaks to the amount of time and care Tolkien put into this world. The second is a small thing, but interesting from a writing perspective. Because Tolkien wrote chronologically, he had already established Boromir and the dream that sent him to Rivendell, which we'll get to a little bit later on. But by putting in Faramir in the Two Towers, he would have to go back and retroactively put into references to Faramir earlier. It's impressive, and again speaks to why it took so long to write. And Tolkien held a special place in his heart for Faramir, writing in a letter to a Mr. Thompson in 1956, he said, as far as any character is like me, it is Faramir, except that I lack what all my characters possess, let the psychoanalysts note, courage. Tolkien even went so far as to give a recurring dream to Faramir that had haunted Tolkien his whole life. In Return of the King, we get this scene between Faramir and Eowyn, more on them later, after the fall of Barad-dûr. As they stood so, their hands met and clasped, though they did not know it, and still they waited for they knew not what. Then presently it seemed to them that above the ridges of the distant mountains another vast mountain of darkness rose, towering up like a wave that should engulf the world. And about it lightnings flickered, and then a tremor ran through the earth, and they felt the walls of the city quiver. A sound like a sigh went up from the lands about them, and their hearts beat suddenly again. "It reminds me of Númenor," said Faramir, and wondered to hear himself speak. "Of Númenor?" said Eowyn. "Yes," said Faramir, "of the land of Westerness that foundered, and of the great dark wave climbing over the green lands and above the hills, and coming on, darkness unescapable. I often dream of it." In a letter to W.H. Auden in 1955, Tolkien wrote, "I have what some might call an Atlantis complex, possibly inherited, though my parents died too young for me to know such things about them, and too young to transfer such things by words. inherited from me, I suppose, by one only of my children, which was Michael, though I did not know about my son until recently, and he did not know it about me. I mean the terrible, recurrent dream, beginning with memory, of the great wave towering up and coming in ineluctably over the trees and green fields. I bequeathed it to Faramir. I don't think I've had it since I wrote The Downfall of Númenor as the last of the legends of the First and Second Age. And in that same letter to Mr. Thompson, Tolkien wrote, "For when Faramir speaks of his private vision of the great wave, he speaks for me. That vision and dream has been ever with me, and has been inherited, as I only recently discovered, by one of my children." And so, with Tolkien's views on war and the literal nightmares of his youth, Faramir is really the closest thing we get to an author self-insert, though in his own words it would be an accidental one, since, again, Faramir just sort of appeared. Okay, so that's his extra-textual history. So let's get into what we actually know about his life. And sticking with Tolkien's preferences, we'll start with his name. Now, interestingly, Faramir's name is the only one of his family that has no definitive known meaning in any of its parts, and it's the only one that isn't shared by a character of the First Age in Middle-earth. Denethor, likely meaning lithe and lank, in the First Age was the king of the Lyquendi of Osiriand in Beleriand, who was slain in the First Battle of Beleriand. Faramir's mother, Finduilis, which, okay, we only know half of this meaning. Fin meant hair. Wheelis is debated. Shared a name with the daughter of Orodreth of Nargothrond, who loved Turin Turambar and who he failed to rescue. And Boromir, a name that might combine Sindarin and Quenya elements to mean steadfast jewel, was the name of a lord of the House of Beor, great-great-grandfather to Beren of Beren and Luthien fame. Now, there was a Faramir, the son of a Gondoran King Ondahur in the Third Age, as well as Gondoran, Denethor, and Boromir, but that name, Faramir, is the only name not found in the First Age of Middle-earth. In Appendix B of Lord of the Rings, we learn that Faramir was born in 2983 of the Third Age, and the very next year, Denethor became Steward when his father, Ecthelion, died. When Faramir was 5 years old, his mother Finduilis died, an event described in Appendix A of the Lord of the Rings like this. She was a lady of great beauty and gentle heart, but before 12 years had passed since her marriage to Denethor, she died. Denethor loved her in his fashion, more dearly than any other, unless it were the elder of the sons that she bore him. But it seemed to men that she withered in the guarded city, as a flower on the seaward vales set upon a barren rock. The shadow in the east filled her with horror, and she turned her eyes ever south to the sea that she missed. So now, filled with grief and steward of a kingdom at war, Denethor largely ignored his younger son. I talk about this more in the second episode of the show, so if you're a new listener and want to hear what this show was like before I knew what I was doing, feel free to check it out. As for the rest of Faramir's youth, we don't get much, but in the appendices, Tolkien gives us a few details, writing, "The sons of Denethor grew to manhood. Boromir, 5 years the elder, beloved by his father, was like him in face and pride, but in little else. Rather, he was a man after the sort of King Eärnur of old, taking no wife and delighting chiefly in arms, fearless and strong, but caring little for lore, save the tales of old battles. Faramir was like him in looks, but otherwise in mind. He read the hearts of men as shrewdly as his father, but what he read moved him sooner to pity than to scorn. He was gentle in bearing, and a lover of lore and of music, and therefore by many in those days his courage was judged less than his brother's. But it was not so, except that he did not seek glory in danger without a purpose. He welcomed Gandalf at such times as he came to the city, and he learned what he could from his wisdom, and in this, as in many other matters, he displeased his father." And that last bit is backed up by Faramir himself when he told the hobbits in the Two Towers, "We in the house of Denethor know much ancient lore by long tradition, and there are, moreover, in our treasuries many things preserved. Books and tablets writ on withered parchments, yea, and on stone, and on leaves of silver and gold, in divers characters. Some none can now read, and for the rest few ever unlock them. I can read a little in them, for I have had teaching. It was these records that brought the Grey Pilgrim to us. I first saw him when I was a child, and he has been twice or thrice since then." This closeness to Gandalf we know about. Remember Denethor dismissively calling him a wizard's pupil. But where you might think that this would have created a wedge between the brothers, the appendices go on to say, "Yet between the brothers there was great love, and had been since childhood, when Boromir was the helper and protector of Faramir. No jealousy or rivalry had arisen between them since, for their father's favor or for the praise of men. It did not seem possible to Faramir that anyone in Gondor could rival Boromir, heir of Denethor, captain of the White Tower, and of like mind was Boromir." There are two ways to read that last sentence. One could be that no one in Boromir's mind was as good as Faramir, but the more likely, arrogant option is that Boromir also thought no one was as good as him. The last little bit that we can glean about what his life was like growing up can be found in a draft of a letter to a critic from 1963, where Tolkien wrote, "I think you misunderstand Faramir. He was daunted by his father, not only in the ordinary way of a family with a stern, proud father of great force of character, but as a Númenórean before the chief of the one surviving Númenórean state. He was motherless and sisterless, and had a bossy brother. He had been accustomed to giving way and not giving his own opinions air, while retaining a power of command among men, such as a man may obtain, who is evidently personally courageous and decisive, but also modest, fair-minded, and scrupulously just, and very merciful." The next definitive thing we know about his life is that on the night before Sauron's attack on Osgiliath, on June 20 of the year 3018, Faramir had a dream, and in the dream he heard a voice saying,
"Seek for the sword that was broken. In Imladris it dwells. There shall be counsels taken, stronger than Morgul spells."
And he had that dream multiple times, and eventually Boromir did as well, and together they went to Denethor asking what it might mean. Denethor knew it referred to Rivendell, and Faramir immediately offered to take the journey, but Boromir insisted that as the eldest and strongest, he should go. Denethor was reluctant, but eventually allowed Boromir to leave, a decision he regretted in the infamous, "Do you wish our places had been exchanged? Yes, I wish that" moment. Top-tier parenting there, Denethor. After Boromir's departure, Faramir was placed in charge of the defense of Osgiliath, where he witnessed Boromir's funeral boat pass by as it followed the Anduin River out to the sea. 2 days after he saw the boat, Appendix B tells us that Denethor sent Faramir into Ithilien on a mission to hinder the Haradrim passing up from the south to join Sauron's army. And we know from Lord of the Rings what happened on that mission. Faramir met Frodo, Sam, and Gollum, and he refused to take the ring. Peter Jackson. He gave them what aid they could, returned to Osgiliath, lost Osgiliath, tried to reclaim Osgiliath, got seemingly mortally wounded, was almost burned alive, but was saved by Pippin and Gandalf, and spent time in the Houses of Healing to recover, where he met Eowyn. Now, much has been said and written about the relationship of Eowyn and Faramir, how it's rushed, how it diminishes Eowyn's role, how it comes across as sexist, etc., etc., etc. And I'm actually not going to get into it this week, because that's a topic I discussed at length with Dr. Sarah Brown in an interview that will be our episode next week. Sorry, Lotruma pals, I'm taking that one out of your hands. I've been sitting on some interviews, and I need to get those out there. But as consolation for not being able to vote, the video of the interview will be available to all paid tiers of the Patreon. But I do want to quote Tolkien, who actually addressed the rushed feeling of their courtship, where he said in that previously mentioned letter to a critic, "Criticism of the speed of the relationship or love of Faramir and Eowyn. In my experience, feelings and decisions ripen very quickly, as measured by mere clock time, which is actually not justly applicable, in periods of great stress, and especially under the expectation of imminent death. And I do not think that persons of high estate and breeding need all the petty fencing and approaches in the matter of love. This tale does not deal with a period of courtly love and its pretenses, but with a culture more primitive, less corrupt, and nobler." And in Faramir we can see maybe a little something else about the professor, because we can see that same young soldier in World War I falling madly in love with his beloved Luthien, Edith. But in response to Abby's question, what happened to Faramir and Eowyn after the war? Well, we know that Éomer went back to Rohan to become king, taking the daughter of Prince Imrahil as his bride. And in The Return of the King, we read this at Aragorn's coronation. "Faramir met Aragorn in the midst of those there assembled, and he knelt and said, 'The last steward of Gondor begs leave to surrender his office.' And he held out a white rod. But Aragorn took the rod and gave it back, saying, "That office is not ended, and it shall be thine and thy heirs as long as my line shall last. Do now thy office." And so Faramir was restored to that original role as steward, and he was later named Prince of Ithilien. And again in that 63 letter to the critic, Tolkien went into detail about what being Prince of Ithilien meant. This is a longer reading, but it's the fullest accounting of what happened to Faramir. To be Prince of Ithilien, the greatest noble after Dol Amroth in the revived Númenórean state of Gondor, soon to be of imperial power and prestige, was not a market garden job, as you term it. Until much had been done by the restored king, the Prince of Ithilien would be the resident march warden of Gondor, in its main eastward outpost, and also would have many duties in rehabilitating the lost territory, and clearing it of outlaws and orc remnants, not to speak of the dreadful vale of Minas Ithil, Morgul. I did not naturally go into details about the way in which Aragorn, as the king of Gondor, would govern the realm, but it was made clear that there was much fighting, and in the earlier years of Aragorn's reign, expeditions against enemies in the east. The chief commanders under the king would be Faramir and Imrahil, and one of these would normally remain a military commander at home in the king's absence. A Númenórean king was monarch, with the power of unquestioned decision in debate, but he governed the realm with the frame of ancient law, of which he was administrator and interpreter, but not the maker. In all debatable matters of important domestic or external, however, even Denethor had a council, and at least listened to what the lords of the fiefs and the captains of the forces had to say. Aragorn re-established the Great Council of Gondor, and in that Faramir, who remained by inheritance the steward, or representative of the king during his absence abroad or sickness, or between his death and the accession of his heir, would be the chief counselor. And Dr. Brown and I talk about this in our interview, but she is definitely of the opinion that in the fighting and clearing of Minas Morgul, Eowyn almost certainly would have been involved in that fighting. Now we know from the History of Middle-earth, Volume 12, The Peoples of Middle-earth, in a section called The Heirs of Elendil, that Faramir lived to be 120 years old, dying in 83 of the Fourth Age, and that he and Eowyn had a son, Elberon, and Elberon had a son named Barahir. And we know that because the prologue of the Fellowship of the Ring, when it's setting up the framing narrative of these stories being the translated version of the Red Book of Westmarch, it says, "In Minas Tirith, the Red Book of Westmarch received much annotation and many corrections, especially of names, words, and quotations in the Elvish languages, and there was added to it an abbreviated version of those parts of the tale of Aragorn and Arwen which lie outside the account of the war. The full tale is stated to have been written by Barahir, grandson of the steward Faramir, sometime after the passing of the king." Now, unfortunately, we don't know any more details about Eowyn's life, but we can assume that she, like Faramir, was happy to the end of her days, to paraphrase Bilbo. And that, Noah and Abby, is everything we know about Faramir and his life with Eowyn. I hope that answered your question. Now we're going to go for a quick break here for a word from Vicky and Tanya at the Ex-Baptist Sisters podcast, but make sure you stick around for an extended version of our segment, News from Arda.
Welcome to the Ex-Baptist Sisters podcast. I'm Vicky.
And this is Tanya.
And we are two sisters haphazardly deconstructing our cult-like religious past in an IFB church setting.
That's Independent Fundamental Baptist.
Our desire is to center each episode around a given topic, but at the end of the day, we're just two sisters hanging out.
We will have a chosen topic each episode to educate people with no church background, and also just give fellow survivors an opportunity to share their stories.
The wind is blowing, the rain is coming down, and here we are on someone's porch trying to lead them to Christ. It was like a business.
But we weren't getting paid. We were in the sales department, but our treasures were in heaven, as they like to say.
We're talking to strangers, and then the strangers are sending their kids with strangers to a building they've never been to go to church.
That's how we first got pulled into the cult, was somebody knocked on our door and invited just the kids to come to Sunday school and ride the bus.
So enjoy your front row seat for every tangent and every story, and share yours too at exbaptistsisters@gmail.com. Join us each week as we unpack suppressed memories and share the path we took to leave a strict oppressive religion and find peace, healing, and joy on the other side. Check out the Ex-Baptist Sisters podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Bye.
Well, thank you, Vicky and Tanya. Fair warning, when, not if, but when you listen to their show, have some Kleenex nearby. They are sharing their experiences with religious trauma and abuse in a really raw and open way, and you're definitely going to want something nearby for the tears. And now we're going to turn to a special edition of our segment, News from Arda. In The Hunt for Gollum news, director and star Andy Serkis was asked in an interview about the lack of diversity in his casting of the upcoming film, and this was his response. Tolkien himself was influenced by Norse mythology, so there's a lot of that feeling. The Shire feels very much like a very white, They're not very concerned about what goes on beyond the borders of the Shire, but they know they don't want people coming in. Yes, there have been criticisms. This particular film is somewhat acknowledging that. But I don't think we will be doing a politically correct, just casting for the sake of casting and ticking boxes version of the film. So it's where relevant, basically. And this response to a perfectly justified question about the lack of diverse casting has ignited a firestorm in the larger Tolkien community, with some using it as a reason to spread the narrative that Lord of the Rings is a white story, and others pushing back against that. Now, it will hopefully come as no surprise to you that I stand with the latter position, and I, along with other fellow Tolkien content creators, stand opposed to the view that 1. The Shire is a whites-only society, and 2. That Tolkien would ever believe that his story was meant for white people only. Now, if you'll allow me, which, you don't have a choice, I'm the one recording this right now, I'm going to walk through the arguments for why this is an incorrect reading of Tolkien's works. I want to acknowledge the dozens of other Tolkien content creators who have taught me so much about this subject in the last week, specifically Calabria Bird, Belmont, and David the Noldo. You can find all of them on social media, but there are many, many more I could mention. Now, let's first start with the idea that within the world, the Shire was some sort of white monoculture. In the prologue to The Lord of the Rings concerning hobbits, we read this about the types of hobbits. The Harfoots were browner of skin, small and shorter, and they were beardless and bootless. Their hands and feet were neat and nimble, and they preferred highlands and hillsides. And later we read, they were the most normal and representative variety of hobbit, and far the most numerous. So the majority of the hobbits, or at least a large plurality, were not fair-skinned, they were browner of skin. And we see this backed up in the Two Towers, in this scene depicting Sam and Frodo. And so Gollum found them hours later when he returned, crawling and creeping down the path out of the gloom ahead. Sam sat propped against the stone, his head dropping sideways and his breathing heavy. In his lap lay Frodo's head, drowned deep in sleep. Upon his white forehead lay one of Sam's brown hands, and the other lay softly upon his master's breast. Peace was in both their faces. Yes, Sam, the hero that carried Frodo up Mount Doom, did not have white skin. Critics of this idea will claim that Tolkien clearly meant that he was tanner as a gardener who worked outdoors. But for about 6 months at this point, he hadn't been gardening, and he had been traveling outdoors frequently at night for the exact same amount of time that Frodo had. And I'm sorry, a tan from summer gardening does not last until March. And Tolkien was perhaps one of the most careful authors in terms of word usage, and in describing one of the Haradrim earlier in the same book, he wrote this. Then suddenly, straight over the rim of their sheltering bank, a man fell, crashing through the slender trees, nearly on top of them. He came to rest in the fern a few feet away, face downward, green arrow feathers sticking from his neck below a golden collar. His scarlet robes were tattered, his corselet of overlapping brazen plates were rent and hewn, his black plaits of hair braided with gold were drenched in blood, his brown hand still clutched the hilt of a broken sword. It's the same book, the same word usage, the same imagery. Sam has brown skin. And so would at least a plurality of Shire folk if the browner-skinned hobbits were the most numerous. So to say that the Shire is a very white community is just factually incorrect. And as for the idea that the hobbits are insular and don't want outsiders, we often hear about dwarves passing through along the road, elves passing into the west through their lands, and yes, even human traders. Hobbits aren't just blatantly xenophobic, they're just very proper and they don't want to go out on adventures. Bilbo was happy to see Gandalf in The Hobbit, the traveling wizard. He just didn't want to leave with him. Now, the critics will say that Tolkien meant for the Shire to be English, and it was based on England. And once upon a time, that was true. But in a letter to Milton Waldman in 1951, Tolkien wrote, "Do not laugh, but once upon a time, my crest has long since fallen, I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the lard and cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story, the larger founded on the lesser in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendor from the vast backcloths, which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country. It should possess the tone and quality that I desired, somewhat cool and clear, be of our air, the clime and soil of the northwest, meaning Britain and in the hither parts of Europe, not Italy or the Aegean, still less the east, and while possessing, if I could believe it, the fair elusive beauty that some call Celtic, though it is rarely found in genuine ancient Celtic things. It should be high, purged of the gross, and fit for the more adult mind of a land long now steeped in poetry. I would draw some of the great tales in fullness, and leave many only placed in the scheme and sketched. The cycles should be linked to a majestic whole, and yet leave scope for other minds and hands, wielding paint and music and drama. Absurd." Now, did you catch that? He started by saying, "Don't laugh, but once upon a time," and he ended with, "absurd." Now, he certainly acknowledged that at one point that was his plan, and it's even the framing device for the Book of Lost Tales. But that version didn't survive the many, many changes of his legendarium. In geography and landscape, certainly the Shire was inspired by Tolkien's native England, but not in its history. But even if one were to say that it is the historical England, which again it isn't, that still wouldn't mean it's all white people. EnglishHeritage.org says that black histories are a vital part of England's story reaching back many centuries. There is evidence of African people in Roman Britain as far back as the 3rd century AD, and black communities have been present since at least 1500. See, the past was a much more diverse place than we imagine, and the idea of a white identity that needed to be upheld is a fairly recent development. Friend and philosopher of the show, Peter Owens, who is working on this very topic for his doctorate, explained it to me like this. "White identity as a phrase is a neo-Nazi dog whistle, but the concept of whiteness is always posterior to the thing that makes whiteness what it is. Like people weren't white until there was something that was not good enough and inferior." And when faced with the idea of whiteness as a preferred identity to those other races, Tolkien unabashedly rejected it. In a 1959 valedictory address at Oxford, Tolkien said, "There are, of course, other lands under the Southern Cross. I was born in one, though I do not claim to be the most learned of those who have come hither from the far end of the Dark Continent. But I have the hatred of apartheid in my bones, and most of all, I detest the segregation or separation of language and literature. I do not care which one of them you think white." In a 1938 letter to his publishers, Tolkien wrote this in response to the Nazi regime demanding that he provide a confirmation of his Aryan heritage before The Hobbit could be translated and sold in Germany. "I do not regard the probable absence of all Jewish blood as necessarily honorable, as I have many Jewish friends, and should regret giving any color to the notion that I subscribe to the wholly pernicious and unscientific race doctrine." And in a copy of the letter that he actually did write to those Germans, he said, "I regret that I am not clear as to what you intend by Arish. I am not of Aryan extraction, that is Indo-Iranian. As far as I am aware, none of my ancestors spoke Flindustani, Persian, Gypsy, or any related dialects. If I am to understand that you are inquiring whether I am Jewish of origin, I can only reply that I regret that I appear to have no ancestors of that gifted people." And at any instance that he could have said, I am white and write white stories meant for white people, he definitively said no. That was not what he was about. He didn't care about that. He was just writing his stories for everyone to enjoy. He did not think there should be white-only literature. And as for Andy Serkis's insistence that it's Norse or Nordic, the words are generally considered to be synonymous here. Tolkien wrote this in a letter to Charlotte and Dennis Plimmer in 1967. Not Nordic, please, a word I personally dislike. It is associated, though of French origin, with racialist theories. Geographically, northern is usually better, but examination will show that even this is inapplicable, geographically or spiritually, to Middle-earth. This is an old word, not invented by me, as a reference to a dictionary such as the shorter Oxford will show. It meant the habitable lands of our world set amid the surrounding ocean. The action of the story takes place in the northwest of Middle-earth, equivalent in latitude to the coastlands of Europe and the north shore of the Mediterranean. But this is not a purely Nordic area in any sense. If Hobbiton and Rivendell are taken as intended to be about the latitude of Oxford, then Minas Tirith, 600 miles south, is at about the latitude of Florence. The mouth of the Anduin and the ancient city of Pelagrir are at about the latitude of ancient Troy. Auden has asserted that for me, the north is a sacred direction. That is not true. The northwest of Europe, where I and most of my ancestors have lived, has my affection, as a man's home should. I love its atmosphere and know more of its histories and languages than I do other pans, but it is not sacred, nor does it exhaust my affections. I have, for instance, a particular love for the Latin language, and among its descendants for Spanish. That it is untrue for my story, a mere reading of the synopses should show. The north was the seat and the fortress of the devil. The progress of the tale ends in what is far more like the re-establishment of an effective Holy Roman Empire with its seat in Rome than anything that could be devised by Nordic. And in a letter to Michael Tolkien in 1941, Tolkien wrote, I have in this war a burning private grudge, which would probably make me a better soldier at 49 than I was at 22, against that ruddy little ignoramus Adolf Hitler, ruining, perverting, misapplying, and making forever accursed that noble northern spirit, a supreme contribution to Europe, which I have ever loved and tried to present in its true light. The racial politics and superiority of whiteness proposed by the Nazis and those that even to this day subscribe to any sort of racial superiority was always by Tolkien flatly rejected. And you may be thinking I'm taking this overboard and unnecessarily focusing on some statements by the director of a film coming out in a year and a half. But my comment sections, and those of my friends, have been filled with some truly reprehensible people using Serkis's words to support their own racism. Now, I don't believe Andy Serkis is racist, nor do I think he realized what his statements would encourage. But we should very clearly state one truth. The Lord of the Rings is and should be for all people, regardless of race, religion, sexuality, or gender identity. The messages of love and courage and hope and kindness and mercy were never meant to belong to a single group. Like the Fellowship itself, a group of diverse forms of many races and backgrounds should make up the world of Middle-earth in all of its forms, and any deliberate attempt to do otherwise is ignorant at best and racist at worst. By trying to justify his lack of diversity within the film by saying, well, Tolkien was drawing on Norse mythology, and by saying that the Shire is white, is a disregard for both the facts within the book and the truth of Tolkien's own life, and we need to call that out. And that was news from Arda. We'll be right back after this word from Peter at Things You Can Do.
Hi, I'm Peter. I'm host of the ethics podcast, Things You Can Do. Sometimes I have a habit of really belaboring a point to extinction, or doing such a deep dive into an idea that I risk losing the plot. That's why I started doing a new segment called Minute History, where I try to tell the story of an idea in under a minute. So here is a brief history of pre-modern computing. The first analog computer was likely a 1st century BCE device called the Antikythera mechanism. An analog computer is a device that attempts to make a model of the system it's trying to solve or predict. The Antikythera mechanism was meant to map the movement of celestial bodies. 9th century Muslim mathematician al-Khwarizmi developed mathematical concepts that would lead to the foundation of modern programming and bear his Latinized name, algorithm. 19th century British polymath Charles Babbage designed several machines that performed mechanical and analog functions similar to modern digital computers, like writable memory and RAM. In 1946, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, or ENIAC, was announced as the first electronic general-purpose computer. It was Turing complete, which means that it's able to be programmed to solve all kinds of different problems in different datasets, rather than just one specific kind of problem. In just a couple years after that, the invention of transistors would launch computing into the digital age. If you want to know more about the history of computing and artificial intelligence and what that has to do with ethics, join me for my 4-part series on AI this summer 2026 on Things You Can Do, available wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're back. And we will turn to our longest ever running segment, This Week in Middle-earth. On July 18 in 3019 of the Third Age, Éomer returns to Rohan following the war, and there he and Gimli settle their differences over Galadriel, with Éomer declaring Arwen the fairest, a position Gimli is able to respect even if he disagrees. And on July 19th, the next day, Theoden's funeral procession departs from Minas Tirith, and that was This Week in Middle-earth. We like to take some time to thank our supporters of the show, so I'm going to summon the Herald.
And now presenting the Lord of the Rings AMA Podcast Patreon Supporters.
In this segment, we thank our Patreon supporters, so thank you to Pete Plays, Checkered Omega, and newest supporter, Gavin. If you would like to join their growing ranks, just head over to Patreon and sign up at any level. But if you're not in a position to do that, you can always be featured in our next segment,
5-star reviews.
This week's 5-star review comes from 1625 Bass, or 1625 Bass. Whether they're talking about a fish or a guitar, I don't know. They write, 5 stars. Awesome LOTR podcast. This is a great podcast. The content is clear and to the point while providing very satisfying and in-depth answers. Matthias has opened my eyes to the rich world of Tolkien and is inspiring me to read more of his works. Thanks for putting these out, and please keep it up. Well, thank you, 1625 Bass/Bass. I will. And if you, like 1625 Bass/Bass, wants to be featured, all you have to do is go to your podcast app of choice and leave a
5-star review.
Thank you again to Noah and Abby for your questions, and to all of you for listening. If you have a question for the show, just head to LOTRAMApod.com, or think of it as lotramapod.com, and click Submit a Question. And while you're there, you can also find links to the Patreon and all of my social media. Feel free to share the show with a Lord of the Rings fan in your life, and make sure you stay subscribed so you don't miss an episode. Thank you, as always, to Peter at Things You Can Do, and Vicky and Tanya at the Ex-Baptist Sisters podcast for their support. To Peter for our stings, Michael for our music, and Lauren for our artwork. And that's all for this week. Iluvatar willing, I'll be back next week. See you then.